As most of you already know by now, on February the 28th, the US and Israel attacked Iran in an unprovoked aggression that has since sent the entire region spiraling. Iran's response, by attacking US bases across the region, most notably Israel, as well as a bunch of other Gulf states, has greatly expanded the scope of the war. And then, on March the 2nd, Hezbollah sent 6 rockets into Israel, which opened up a new front in this regional war. Well, opened up isn't really the right word, because that front was never really closed. That is, Israel never stopped bombing Lebanon even after signing the ceasefire deal in November 27, 2024. All this to say that there is a lot going on right now. There are so many actors, and the situation is incredibly fluid. I don't think anyone has a coherent picture of what's happening, or where exactly this all leads us. I certainly don't. And at the moment, most of my focus is on the displacement crisis happening in Lebanon as a result of the Israeli assault. To that end, I will have a link in the description for a very trusted grassroots network in Lebanon working on providing the necessities for displaced people in Beirut. I personally know a lot of people organizing with this group, so if you're able to, please donate, and if you're unable to, at least share the link. Now, this video will not try to explain the situation. Instead, I want to do a sort of public service announcement about the main media outlets that are available in English. For one, I do see a lot of people asking, where can I get reliable news on what's happening in the region? But beyond that, in the social media age we're in, media literacy has definitely taken a hit. As in, I see a lot of people sharing very clearly AI-generated videos and images about this war, or people quoting sources that are either notoriously unreliable or at least very clearly biased. So what I'm going to do in this video is share with you where I personally get my news, and sort of do a review of those media organizations and platforms in a sort of objective way. I will share why I follow these platforms and organizations, and the limitations they have. I originally wanted to make this video a bit more expansive, and review basically all the large organizations that are covering the war, but I'm definitely not in the headspace to do that. So I'm going to limit it to just the English-speaking daily news organizations that I personally follow. The ones I don't mention, well, I won't mention them for one reason or another. If there is a big one that I missed, then ask me about it in the comments below, and I'll try to get to it. And also as a bonus, I will also share with you some websites and, let's say, strategies I've personally been employing to stay up to date and make sure I'm getting reliable and grounded information. So, first up, we have one of the main ones, the only traditional news station I follow regularly, which is number 1, Al-Jazeera. First, I'll make a small note about Al-Jazeera Arabic before getting to the English version. Now, in case you didn't know, the memes are true. Al-Jazeera remains the main source of news for Arabic speakers across the Swana region that covers the region as a whole. The Twitter account for Al-Jazeera Breaking News is the closest thing we have in the Arabic-speaking world to a regional wire service. It is the place to stay up to date minute by minute, which, in my experience, is not the healthiest thing, but when it's your city getting bombed, sometimes you do want those immediate updates. Beyond that, Al Jazeera has a 24-hour live stream on its website and on YouTube, and has constant live footage across the region. So at the moment, you regularly see the skylines of Beirut, Tehran, Haifa, Baghdad, Qatar, and the like. Now, of course, they are able to do this because Al Jazeera is a huge organization with a lot of money and a lot of journalists across the entire Swana region, as well as around the globe. Also, it's one of the few, possibly the only from the region, that has successfully entered the Western media landscape, specifically through Al Jazeera English. For a lot of people, Al Jazeera's coverage of the genocidal war in Gaza has been pretty essential. Not only because they cover it very thoroughly and have numerous journalists within Gaza, unlike most other organizations, but also because their coverage has been largely supportive of the Palestinian cause and against the Israeli occupation. For most English speakers, who are surrounded by very biased and very Zionist news outlets, Al Jazeera English is a breath of fresh air. I've personally been following Al Jazeera English since I began to follow the news some 16 years ago. God, I'm getting old. Now, I've definitely noticed that many have only ever heard criticism of Al Jazeera from Zionists, and so they're a bit shocked when I tell them that there are other unrelated criticisms. And those criticisms are important to note in order to understand how to view and how to navigate Al Jazeera. The main thing is that Al Jazeera is owned by the Qatari monarchy. This means there's never any criticism of the Qatari state on the network. It's oftentimes used to launder the monarchy's image, and is sometimes a platform by which the government releases its statements to the world. Mentioning all this feels very important in the context of the current war, especially since Qatar is very much so involved. Beyond this, Al Jazeera's editorial line is also strictly in line with the desires of the Qatari monarchy. This didn't used to be as much of a problem before, especially back when Qatar didn't have that much regional or international influence, which meant that the window of what could be said was pretty wide. But ever since, especially very recently, that window has gotten smaller and smaller. So, for instance, Al Jazeera's coverage of both Turkey and Iran have been really bad, sometimes bordering on the propagandistic. Take, for instance, the recent protests and subsequent massacre in Iran. Al Jazeera didn't cover it at all, and would rely almost solely on government sources and doing interviews with the foreign minister and the like. They notably never talked about the killings, never even mentioned that there were reports on them or that some people were saying that there were these mass killings. They just didn't mention it. And there's kind of that same bias when it goes to anything related to Turkey, especially in relation to the Kurds. I've personally noticed this shift in 2015 after the Gulf blockade of Qatar, which I think was also a turning point for the country in terms of its shifting alliances, especially with it getting closer to Erdogan and to the Iranian regime. And now that Qatar is being attacked by Iran, Al Jazeera feels like it's in this very funny place. This headline, for instance, caught my eye. Like, that's how they're talking about themselves getting bombed. To me, it sounds like, yeah, they're bombing us, but we low-key deserve it. But anyway, watching both Al Jazeera English and Arabic is always really funny, because in the latter, they really don't try to mask who they are and what they're about. Whereas for the former, in Al Jazeera English, they're very intentful about their image. I think, simply put, they don't have to pretend to Arabs, but to English speakers, they present themselves very differently. There are, of course, a lot of people in the region who don't like Al Jazeera because of its political affiliations. For instance, it very openly supported the Arab Spring revolutions that started in 2011, particularly in its coverage of the Syrian revolution and the subsequent war. This caused a lot of people to turn away from Al Jazeera, most notably within Lebanon, where the channel Al-Mayadeen was created in order to counter Al Jazeera's narrative in Syria and bolster a pro-Hezbollah, pro-Assad regime narrative. But so yes, it does have its political biases that are decided in conjunction with the Qatari monarchy. But we shouldn't forget that this is the channel of the martyrs Shireen Abu Aqli and Anas al-Sharif, alongside dozens of others who are brave journalists on the front lines, giving us unique access to situations of occupation, aggression, and genocide. Anyway, that's my whole thing about Al Jazeera. Number 2. Democracy Now! This is another media organization that's pretty well established on the left, especially those who follow international news. I've also been watching Democracy Now!, which is broadcast out of New York, for over a decade now as well, but lately much more so. I basically listen to it every day, specifically the headline section. Basically, every weekday, they put out an hour-long episode that starts with 15 to 20 minutes of global headlines, and then spends the rest of the hour covering different topics in depth. Because Democracy Now! Is an independent media organization, it means that they're not allegiant to any state or to any corporate interest. They've also been at this for quite a while, which really lends to its credibility. For instance, they recently covered the killing of the feminist activist Yanar Muhammad in Iraq, and when doing so, shared an interview they themselves conducted with Yanar 20 years earlier. Now, my main gripe with Democracy Now! Is that they do have guests that are not my favorite people. As in, they platform campists quite frequently. If you want to know what those are, check out my last video on campism, or rather on tankies. This is why I often only listen to the headlines and skip the interviews. For instance, they recently had Medea Benjamin of Code Pink on to talk about Cuba, which is like, there's so many other people you could have had on, and she is a notorious campist. I also remember a few months ago, they had this very weird debate about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where they had, I think is John Mersheimer, and some standard US academic. It really wasn't a debate. It's just Mersheimer doing Russian propaganda, and the other guy quoting Putin to him and saying, what you're saying is not true, because it's contradicting what Putin himself said. And this has been a problem on Democracy Now! That I've noticed over the last decade. And those debates used to happen a lot over Syria. And even though it felt like having two sides of an argument, first of all, usually there wouldn't be a Syrian, or in this case, a Ukrainian, that has an ability to share their perspective and actually be part of the debate. But also, it's not a debate in terms of two factual but opposing sides. It just kind of feels boring and frustrating, and it just... whatever. Those examples exist, but lately I've definitely noticed that they're few and far between, but there is still that tendency to platform campists and give them airspace, which I obviously don't agree with. But yes, aside from that, they do often have very, very good and very interesting guests, and it is still an invaluable asset, especially for topics and regions I otherwise don't have access to. Their coverage of the current war is also very good, and some of the people they've been interviewing to talk about Lebanon, to talk about Iran, I thought have been very good, and this is a big reason why I'm recommending it here. So yes, Democracy Now! I would recommend it, especially its daily headlines, but I would definitely give a warning about some of the more colorful guests that they have on. Also, there is just this one bit that I love of Amy Goodman chasing this US politician at COP28 for 10 minutes straight that I loved watching at the time and has become a kind of inside joke in this household. Number 3. Megaphone News. Megaphone is a very interesting media outlet because it's one of the very few, I think basically the only independent alternative media organization from the region that has the output that it does. Based in Lebanon, Megaphone started in 2018 by activist journalists who were involved in local protest movements. Actually, the name Megaphone comes from the fact that most of the founders, at one point or another, held megaphones and led chants in protests in Beirut. The group rapidly grew in 2019 when the October 17 revolution erupted in Lebanon, and the need for on-the-ground coverage became really high. While mainstream channels covered the protests from afar, Megaphone journalists filmed from within the crowds and would remain long into the night, well after mainstream journalists had left the square and headed to their studios. Since they're an independent organization, they are unlike basically every Lebanese outlet, explicitly anti-sectarian and anti-corporate. They rely on crowdfunding and select grants to keep up their operations. Some may see those grants as compromising their message, especially since most of those grants are either from the EU or US-based organizations. But I personally don't see their work being that influenced by their sources of funding. And I have definitely noticed in the last few years them moving more towards crowdfunding and community support to move away from any potential problems with, being funded by grants. To me, their coverage of the war has been essential. Less so for the analysis, but more for the daily coverage and their explainer videos. On basically every social media, including directly on WhatsApp, Megaphone releases a daily video every weekday about what happened that day in Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Iran, the Gulf, etc. The videos are bilingual and provide a very clean overview of the otherwise very confusing and very diffuse war. And they do also do other videos aside from those daily recaps. They still do short explainer videos and interviews that are very social media friendly and are really vital to understand the situation in Lebanon. For instance, they recently did a video about some of the grassroots efforts happening in Lebanon to support the displaced. Or another example is their coverage of the arrest of this Lebanese rapper who was arrested in the midst of war for criticizing the Lebanese president. These may seem like details to those that are interested in the macro geopolitical level, but it's really essential coverage of the polycrisis in Lebanon. So aside from that, I've definitely heard criticisms of Megaphone from people back home, particularly as it relates to some of the essays they published in their opinion section. I've also heard some pretty valid criticism of their work when it feels like they're stretching themselves beyond their base of knowledge. They did a video a few years ago, for instance, when Azerbaijan was ethnically cleansing the Armenian territory of Artsakh, that was pretty heavily criticized at the time as being inaccurate and, not with the thorough knowledge of the region, of the struggle, of the history. But yeah, I pin that down less to bad politics and more to them kind of discussing something that they don't have the same resources to cover appropriately, like they do for Lebanon or Syria and the like. This is also a bit of a limitation they have when it comes to this regional and, in many cases international scale of the current war. But still, Megaphone are incomparably better than any other media organization in Lebanon that works at the scale they do, especially the sectarian media, which dominates the landscape. And so, Megaphone is a really important source for me, and is definitely one of the few local media organizations that I push people everywhere to follow. Number 4. DropSite News. DropSite News is a pretty new addition to the independent media outlet landscape in the United States. Its website is basically just a professional Substack website, with some social media presence aside from that. They do daily stuff. I, for instance, am subscribed to their newsletter, so I get their articles and their daily headlines by email. Like all the other ones I've mentioned, they've been doing a pretty good job of covering the current war, not only with some of those overviews, but also some of their own investigations. The main thing about DropSite News is that they do have very good investigative journalists. A lot of them used to be part of The Intercept, but left after The Intercept became a bit weird. So DropSite News does very good, in-depth, and unique investigations, meaning sometimes they're the first to report on something. Also, on that point, some other journalists, especially Jeremy Scahill, have a very weird level of access to some sources. For instance, a few weeks ago, it was through a DropSite News interview that it was announced that Hamas rejected calls to disarm, saying that it wasn't part of the initial agreement. Like, Scahill somehow flies into the region, gets these exclusive interviews with very high-level officials in Hamas, and then flies out. Which, it's fine, it's great, it's what journalism is supposed to be, but it's just weird that he's just able to do it. that kind of access is very rare in English-speaking media. And again, with DropSite news, it's that you heard it here first kind of thing. My main issues with DropSite news, kind of similar to what I said about Democracy Now!, but in some cases, it's even worse. As in, they quite often platform leftist campus on their social media accounts, which is not great. But beyond that, I remember a few weeks ago, they reposted a video by Tucker Carlson, the far-right American commentator, because he said some good stuff against Israel. Like, Democracy Now! Would never. But yeah, I tend not to look at DropSite for any, political analysis as a result. It's more for, unique intelligence. Also, DropSite News is quite small. It's just a handful of journalists, mostly based in the West. So the scope of their coverage is never that expansive. That said, some of their coverage of what's happening in Lebanon is through journalists on the ground, and those articles have been very good. Number 5. LiveUA Maps. So, this is one of those bonus things that I told you about early on. Because this isn't a website or a platform like any of the others. And in order to explain what it is, I'm going to have to show it to you on screen and do one of those picture-in-picture things, because there's a lot and it's a very interesting and useful website with some limitations. But before I get into any of that, this is what it looks like. So this is LiveUA Map. And as you can see, it's a world map with symbols indicating where things have happened in the location that they happened. I'm going to explain how to navigate this website, what all these symbols mean, and basically how you can get the most out of this without getting the bad stuff. Before I start with how to navigate this website, I'm going to talk about that bad stuff. For me, my main problem with this website is that it's inherently dehumanizing, as in, there's no people, there are no communities. This is a pure geopolitical chessboard. But with that said, if you use this but supplement it with, or use this as a supplement to the other stuff that I've been mentioning in this video, I think it's fine, and actually has a lot of benefits and, useful aspects that you don't get on those other things. So let's start. First of all, you'll notice on the top here that you have 4 different locations with active conflicts: Ukraine, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. You can also select regions to select other regions such as Sudan or Yemen or the Caucasus. But these 4 are the main ones here because not only are they sort of the most active, but specific on this website, they're the ones with the most amounts of feed and information and the place that it's being updated the most. So if you zoom in, you can see here, for instance, in Tehran, different bombardments. Here, if you click on this thing, this symbol, it'll open up this thing over here on the right, airstrikes in Tehran last night. And it's important to note, this isn't an organization. This isn't a group of journalists. This is operated based on open source intelligence. So for every piece of information, there will be a source that you can click on, and it'll take you to the source of that information. In this case, it's a post on X, formerly Twitter, and it's by someone named Michael Horowitz. Here, what you can do if you want to look more into it, I mean, there are images as well, is go onto the person's account, see if they're a legitimate source, if they're someone that you can trust, if it's not someone that's doing like AI slop or something. Going back to the website. So as you can see, there are different symbols. And on the top right here, you can click key to see what those symbols mean. So this one that looks like a missile is a shelling. This one that looks like a megaphone is an announcement. Where is that? Whatever, it's somewhere over here. Oh, here, speech or statement. So if you click on that again, Iranian Foreign Minister, America started the war seeking our unconditional surrender and is now begging other countries to open up the Strait of Hormuz. Likewise, here there's a phone, or yes, President Pezeshkian calls his French counterpart or whatever. And when you zoom in, there is something very detailed about this map that is part of the open intelligence format, which is, it's not just a bombing in Tehran. Here you can see that, at least this is indicating, that there was a bombing of this airport over here, or that this bombing is on the outskirts of the city. And again, this is really important because especially when we're dealing with situations and conflicts in areas we're not familiar with, understanding the geography, the different locations, the names of these cities is really important. I think people hear Iran, and especially people in the US who notoriously do not have a good understanding of geography. It's very helpful to see, here is Tehran, and here is the Strait of Hormuz. And here is this northern region where there's conflict with Kurdish forces in what Kurds call Rojalat. So in a nutshell, that is LiveUA Map. And you can zoom in then also on the Gulf, see what's happening here, reports of bombings in Bahrain, in Dubai, and the like. Now, if we go to Lebanon for a minute, there's something also a bit important that this website helps you understand that you don't necessarily see on other platforms. Not only do you see the bombardments and the areas that the Israelis are striking, or where missiles are being fired from into occupied territories, but you also see this coloration that we saw earlier. This slightly faded red area is the area up until the Litani River, where the Israelis have ordered this mass evacuation order in the first few days of the escalation. This darker red area is that second large mass evacuation order. Likewise, if you go up here, this very large red area in the southern suburbs of Beirut is another mass evacuation order. This is what's known as Dahi, which is a series, a combination of neighborhoods. And again, what you get a sense here is this is quite literally almost like half of Beirut that the Israelis have condemned to bombing regularly, to what they say to create another Khan Yunis, to do a genocide like they've done in Gaza, but in Beirut. And also, sometimes you do have bombardments like we've seen in the last few days outside of this area. And again, for those that don't know the geography, don't know the city, you can see that through this map. One last thing that's really important as well is, especially because the Israelis are already invading the south of Lebanon, you can see through this different discolorations or choices of colors, this blue area. You see these small blue areas here. These are the areas that the Israelis occupied after the so-called ceasefire deal in 2024, the notorious 5 spots. But as you can see, they've expanded. And this indicates that the Israelis have a presence in these areas. And so, for instance, here you see tanks. Israeli vehicles spotted encroaching near the town of Yarun and Marun Ros. And so that's something that's really important to sort of like be aware of and to see the sort of different areas that the Israelis are at least claiming. Oh, actually, one very interesting thing is, you can choose between languages if you look at the top right over here. But secondly, you can also go back in time. And if you, for instance, go back to Syria and you go back in time, this is a map that a lot of us are very familiar with, and especially these colors or what this indicated. So January 12, 2023. You see the territories that different forces control. The yellow was the SDF, the red was the regime, and the like. So that is LiveUA Map. Number 6, Instagram. Now, aside from those specific organizations or websites, I also want to share how I've been going about using social media these days. I'm mostly on Instagram, especially since leaving Twitter after Musk took over, and I'm also on Blue Sky, but there's really not much going on over there. I'm kind of one of the few people talking about Lebanon, so that's not great. Still, it's better than being on Twitter. If I ever do go on Twitter, it's like a surgical operation to get specific info or specific accounts and see what they're saying and then get out. One thing I avoid doing on Instagram these days is scrolling, because I think that's a really dangerous thing to do with just how much misinformation and AI slop there is going around these days. I mostly follow individuals and groups that I know and trust, and mostly just look through stories to avoid the algorithm. These individuals are usually people who are on the ground in Lebanon or Syria, or whose politics I generally trust. I also follow certain accounts that have been giving me more insights into what's happening in Iran and within Persian-speaking media, especially because otherwise I don't have much access to that as an Arabic-speaking Lebanese person. This, of course, is a process of curation, which takes a while and requires intent based on, your individual needs and preferences. Also, it's through social media that I get access to what is coming out of Western mainstream media, which in some cases, like some of the investigations, is fine. But yeah, otherwise, I never really follow CNN or BBC or anything like that. And if I do, I have to view it through the lens of manufacturing consent. As in, they're not lying outright, they just really bend the truth through framing and passive language. One important thing as well is I try to avoid getting too overwhelmed on social media, especially with how, when you scroll through the algorithm, you get this really morbid mix of serious stuff like explosions, and then some white person in the US commenting on Jim Carrey's weird new appearance. Psychologically, this is so harmful, which is a big part of why I avoid it as much as possible. One last thing that I will say here, even though it might not be the most accessible thing for people, is that some of the best knowledge production coming out of Lebanon, the best commentaries on what's happening in the country, are coming out of its meme pages. This is honestly a thesis I'm working on for a future video essay, but yeah, here's a shout out to Wa'al Kfouri Mindset memes and Gigaphone memes for basically keeping me sane over the last few years. Number 7, group chat. So my last strategy that I found really helpful to getting off of social media, but also staying in touch with current events, is to create or join group chats with like-minded people. I'm actually currently part of a number of these types of groups. And these groups can be really helpful, and I think actually super important to validate certain news or opinion, and just be sort of in community around the news that you're trying to process. All of this stuff is impossible to deal with by yourself, and we were never meant to know this much about the world. And you most likely already have a couple of friends that you share news stuff with. But yeah, I've found it so useful, especially when there's just so much noise and in general so much going on, to have a dedicated space with 10, 20, 30 people where you can share and discuss and, again, sort of validate sometimes. Is this a good source? What's the bias of this source? How should you read this? So yeah, create a group of people, join one that already exists, and start basically employing a kind of open source intelligence strategy. A lot of these groups already exist in the form of Telegram and WhatsApp channels, but they also have this problem of having an unidentified bias that's sometimes hard to identify. So yeah, those are all the things. I hope this helped, and I will soon try to release an actual video essay, maybe the one I was working on before all of this kicked off, maybe a new one about Israel's long war on Lebanon. But for the time being, please, if you can, support grassroots aid organizations and groups in Lebanon, I will have a link to a very trusted and, let's say, vetted one in the description below. And so, yeah, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you all in the next one. Here's a thank you to my very first patrons: Muhammad, Janet Robertson, Alex the Violist, Hyacinth Peel, Lindsay Coots, Karam Bolaj, M. Lunger, Jan W., Macy, Tim Lawyer, Marta Costa, and Jonathan Maddox. If you want to see your name on the screen or heard it read out at the end of one of my videos, please consider heading over to my Patreon and becoming a member. Over there, you'll also get access to my past, current, and future videos ad-free. Thank you to everyone who has already joined my Patreon, and everyone who will after hearing this. Thank you, and stay safe.